A quiet courtroom erupts into chaos when 15-year-old Elijah Carmichael, accused of a petty crime, stands up and boldly declares, "My dad is your boss." The judge freezes, the spectators gasp, and the truth that follows threatens to upend powerful reputations and long-buried secrets. What led to this shocking moment? And how will one boy's courage change the lives of everyone involved? The courtroom was tense, its somber atmosphere broken only by the quiet murmur of voices and the rustling of papers. 15-year-old Elijah Carmichael sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders squared but his hands clenched tightly in his lap. His neatly pressed shirt and slacks did little to hide the unease in his posture. Beside him, his court-appointed attorney, Angela Price, flipped through a thick folder of documents, occasionally glancing at him with a reassuring smile. Despite her calm demeanor, Elijah knew she was fighting an uphill battle. At the bench sat Judge Meredith Sinclair, a sharp-featured woman in her late 50s known for her unrelenting approach to law and order. Her piercing eyes scanned the courtroom before landing on Elijah, her expression cool and unyielding. She was a woman with a reputation to uphold, and she showed little patience for what she often referred to as excuses. The charges against Elijah seemed minor, trespassing on private property in an upscale gated community, but the situation had spiraled out of control. Elijah and his friends had been skateboarding in a neighborhood park when security guards stopped them. While his friends were let off with warnings, Elijah had been detained and ultimately charged. The reason for the disparity was clear to Elijah, though no one wanted to say it outright. "Mr. Carmichael," Judge Sinclair began, her voice cold and formal, "you stand accused of trespassing on private property, an offense that demonstrates a clear disregard for the law. Do you understand the seriousness of your actions?" Elijah opened his mouth to speak, but his throat felt tight. He glanced at Angela, who gave him a slight nod. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice low but steady. Judge Sinclair leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in front of her. "This is not your first encounter with the law, is it?" she continued, her tone laced with judgment. "I see here that you've been issued warnings for loitering and minor property damage in the past." Angela quickly interjected. "Your Honor, if I may, those were isolated incidents, and no formal charges were filed. Elijah has been making efforts to stay out of trouble." Judge Sinclair raised a hand to silence her. "Efforts, perhaps, but not enough," she said, her gaze returning to Elijah. "Young man, this court exists to hold individuals accountable for their actions, particularly those who seem incapable of doing so themselves. It's clear to me that you lack proper guidance and discipline." The word stung, and Elijah felt his hands tighten into fists under the table. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, the unspoken assumptions about who he was and where he came from hanging heavy in the air. He looked down, his jaw clenched. Judge Sinclair continued, her voice growing sharper. "Perhaps a more severe penalty will teach you the value of respecting the law and the property of others." Elijah couldn't hold back any longer. He pushed his chair back slightly and stood, his eyes locking onto the judge. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he began, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear, "you don't know anything about me." The courtroom fell silent, and Angela's face paled as she whispered, "Elijah, sit down." But Elijah didn't. He swallowed hard, summoning the courage he hadn't known he had. "You're sitting up there judging me like I'm some kind of criminal, but I'm not," he said. "I was skateboarding in a park. That's it. And now you're talking about discipline like you know my life." Judge Sinclair's eyes narrowed, her composure beginning to crack. "Mr. Carmichael, I suggest you think very carefully about what you say next," she said, her voice dangerously low. Elijah took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "Maybe you should think about how you treat people," he said, his voice steady now. "Because my dad is your boss." The words hung in the air like a bombshell, and the courtroom erupted into murmurs and gasps. Judge Sinclair's face drained of color, and for the first time, she looked genuinely unsettled. What did you just say?" she asked, her voice faltering. "You heard me," Elijah replied, his gaze unwavering. "My dad is Lionel Carmichael." The murmurs grew louder, and Judge Sinclair banged her gavel, though her hand trembled slightly. "Order," she barked, though her voice lacked its usual authority. She stared at Elijah for a long moment, then abruptly stood. "This court is in recess," she announced, retreating to her chambers without another word. As the courtroom buzzed with speculation, Angela leaned over to Elijah, her voice urgent but soft. "Elijah, what just happened? Is that true? Is Lionel Carmichael really your father?" Elijah nodded, his hands shaking now that the adrenaline had worn off. "Yeah," he said quietly. "But he's never been around." Angela stared at him, trying to process the revelation. "Elijah, this changes everything," she said. "But we need to be careful." Elijah nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what careful would look like. All he knew was that for the first time in his life, he had spoken up for himself, and he wasn't going to let anyone silence him again. The courtroom was still buzzing with speculation long after Judge Sinclair had stormed out. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, spectators whispered to each other, and Angela Price was doing everything she could to shield Elijah from the prying eyes and questions swirling around them. Elijah, on the other hand, sat quietly, staring at the empty judge's bench. He was trying to process what he had just done. His words had come out in a moment of frustration, but now that they were out there, he couldn't take them back. Angela leaned closer to him, lowering her voice. "Elijah, I need you to explain what just happened. Is Lionel Carmichael really your father?" Elijah hesitated. He didn't want to talk about it, not here, not in front of strangers. But he knew Angela wasn't going to let it go. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's my dad. But it's not like he's ever been around." Angela blinked, stunned by the simplicity of his statement. "Does the judge know that? Does she have any connection to him?" "I think so," Elijah replied. "Mom told me he's a big deal. He donates to judges and stuff." Angela's brow furrowed. "Lionel Carmichael is more than a big deal," she said. "He's one of the most powerful men in the country. If what you're saying is true, this could blow up fast." Elijah didn't respond. He was already regretting his outburst, but a part of him was also glad. For once, people were paying attention. Maybe now, they would finally listen to his side of the story. Meanwhile, in her chambers, Judge Sinclair was pacing furiously, her usual composure shattered. She picked up her phone and dialed her assistant. "I need a full report on Elijah Carmichael," she snapped. "Every detail, now." As she waited for the information to arrive, her mind raced. The name Lionel Carmichael was one she knew well. He wasn't just a wealthy benefactor, he was the benefactor. His funding had been instrumental in her rise to the bench, and she had always made sure to handle his connections with care. If Elijah was truly his son, her treatment of him could be seen as a scandal, one that could destroy her career. When her assistant returned with a folder of information, Sinclair's worst fears were confirmed. Elijah's birth certificate listed Lionel Carmichael as his father, though the document also noted that he had not been involved in the boy's life. Sinclair closed the folder with a trembling hand. This was more complicated than she had anticipated. Across town, Lionel Carmichael sat in his glass-walled office, staring at his tablet. The headline on the screen read, "Judge humiliates teen in court, boy claims billionaire father." He clenched his jaw, scrolling through the article. The story was vague, but it was already gaining traction. Reporters were piecing together the connection between him and Elijah, and it wouldn't be long before the media frenzy escalated. "Sir," his assistant, Henry, interrupted, entering the room cautiously. "We've got reporters calling for a statement. Do you want me to prepare something?" Lionel shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "I need to handle this personally." Henry hesitated. "Do you want me to contact Ms. Nadia?" At the mention of Elijah's mother, Lionel's expression softened. He hadn't spoken to Nadia in years, though he had thought about her more often than he cared to admit. "Yes," he said after a long pause. "Set up a meeting. And find out everything you can about the case." Later that evening, Elijah returned home to their modest apartment, where his mother, Nadia, was waiting for him. She had seen the news and was already bracing for the conversation. Nadia was a woman of quiet strength, her sharp features softened by years of hard work and sacrifice. As Elijah stepped through the door, she crossed her arms and gave him a pointed look. "What happened today?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Elijah dropped his backpack by the door and sank onto the couch. "I said something I probably shouldn't have," he admitted. Nadia raised an eyebrow. "You think?" She sat down beside him, her expression softening. "Elijah, you know we don't rely on your father for anything. Why did you bring him up in court?" "Because I was tired of being treated like trash," Elijah exclaimed, his voice cracking. "She was talking to me like I'm some criminal, like I don't matter. I couldn't just sit there and take it, Mom." Nadia sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I get it, Elijah. I do. But Lionel is not the answer. He's not going to swoop in and fix everything." Elijah looked down at his hands. "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But I had to say something. I'm sick of people acting like I'm nobody." Nadia reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not nobody," she said. "You're my son, and that's enough. But bringing your father into this, it's only going to complicate things." "I know," Elijah said. "But I didn't know what else to do." Nadia sighed again, pulling him into a hug. "We'll figure it out," she said. "But next time, let's talk about it first." Meanwhile, Lionel sat in his car outside the apartment building, watching the windows light up as Elijah and Nadia moved around inside. He hadn't told Henry he planned to stop by, he wasn't even sure what he was going to say. But seeing Elijah in the courtroom, hearing the pain in his voice, had awakened something in him he hadn't felt in years: guilt. Lionel sighed and leaned back in his seat. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the family he had abandoned, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't ignore this any longer. The next morning, Elijah woke up to the sound of his mother's voice. Nadia was on the phone in the kitchen, her tone sharp and uncharacteristically tense. Elijah sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and strained to hear. "I don't care what he wants," Nadia said, her voice firm but controlled. "He doesn't get to waltz back into our lives just because it's convenient for him." Elijah crept closer to the doorway, careful not to make a sound. "What's best for Elijah is stability," she continued. "Not empty promises." Elijah felt a pang of guilt. He knew she was talking about his father. His outburst in court had set off a chain reaction he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Just then, Nadia ended the call and turned around, startled to see Elijah standing there. "Who was that?" Elijah asked cautiously. Nadia sighed, setting her phone down on the counter. "Your father's assistant," she admitted. "Lionel wants to meet." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. "And what did you say?" "I said no," Nadia replied. "You don't need him, Elijah. We've done just fine without him." "But what if I want to meet him?" Elijah said, his voice quiet but firm. "Don't I get a say?" Nadia stared at him, her expression softening. "Elijah, I just don't want you to get hurt," she said. "He's not the man you think he is." Elijah looked down, his hands fidgeting. "I don't care if he's perfect," he said. I want to know why he left." Nadia hesitated, then sighed deeply. "All right," she said finally. "But if this goes wrong, don't say I didn't warn you." Later that day, Lionel Carmichael sat in his sleek office, staring out at the city skyline. His assistant, Henry, entered quietly, carrying a file. They've agreed to meet, he said, placing the file on Lionel's desk. Lionel turned around, nodding. Thank you, Henry, he said. Have you handled the press inquiries? Most of them, Henry replied. But this story is gaining traction. If you don't release a statement soon, it's going to spiral. Lionel waved a hand dismissively. I'll deal with it after the meeting, he said. Right now, my focus is on Elijah. Henry hesitated. Are you sure you're ready for this? He asked. It's been, 15 years? Lionel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. No, he admitted. But I can't ignore it anymore. The meeting was set for the following evening at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Lionel arrived early, his usual air of confidence replaced by visible nerves. He ordered a coffee and sat at a corner table, his gaze flicking toward the door every few seconds. When Nadia and Elijah walked in, Lionel stood immediately, his tall frame almost awkward in its eagerness. Nadia's expression was cool and guarded, while Elijah's was a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Thank you for coming, Lionel said, motioning for them to sit. Nadia slid into the booth, keeping a protective hand on Elijah's shoulder. Let's just get this over with, she said flatly. Lionel winced but nodded. Fair enough, he said. He turned his attention to Elijah. You've grown so much, he said, his voice soft. I've seen pictures, but it's different seeing you in person. Elijah shrugged, his gaze fixed on the table. Yeah, well, you missed a lot. The word stung, but Lionel didn't argue. I know, he said. And I'm sorry. I made a lot of mistakes, Elijah. Walking away from you and your mom was the biggest one. Why did you leave? Elijah asked, his voice trembling slightly. Was it because you didn't want me? No, Lionel said quickly. It wasn't that. I was young and stupid, and I let my career take over my life. I thought staying away would make things easier for everyone. But I see now that I was wrong. Nadia crossed her arms, her expression unrelenting. That's a nice speech, Lionel, but words don't mean much. You've had 15 years to reach out. Why now? Lionel hesitated, his gaze dropping. Because I saw Elijah in court, he admitted. I saw the way he stood up for himself, and I realized how much I've missed. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to try to be part of his life now. Elijah finally looked up, his eyes searching Lionel's face. How do I know you won't just disappear again? He asked. You don't, Lionel said honestly. But I'll prove it to you, Elijah. Whatever it takes. Nadia scoffed, shaking her head. We'll see, she said. But I'm not letting you hurt him again. I won't, Lionel promised. I'm here to stay. Elijah wanted to believe him. A part of him even felt a flicker of hope. But the wounds of the past ran deep, and it would take more than promises to heal them. The days following the meeting were filled with uncertainty for everyone involved. Lionel had made his intentions clear, but neither Nadia nor Elijah was fully ready to trust him. Elijah found himself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. He wanted to believe that Lionel genuinely cared, but the years of absence and unanswered questions weighed heavily on him. At home, Nadia watched her son carefully. She could tell he was distracted, quieter than usual. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching TV, she muted the show and turned to him. Talk to me, she said softly. Elijah hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. I don't know what to think, he admitted. He seemed sincere. But what if he's just saying all the right things to make himself feel better? Nadia sighed, leaning back against the cushions. That's what I'm worried about too, she said. Your father has always been good with words. But actions? That's another story. Elijah looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. Do you think I should give him a chance? I think that's up to you, Nadia said. But whatever you decide, just remember that you don't owe him anything. He's the one who left, not you. Elijah nodded, but the weight of the decision still hung over him. Meanwhile, Lionel was determined to prove that he meant what he said. He began by reaching out to Angela Price, Elijah's attorney, to discuss the court case. They met in her office, a modest but professional space filled with case files and books. "Mr. Carmichael," Angela said, her tone neutral as she sat across from him. "What can I do for you?" "I want to help with Elijah's case," Lionel said. "Whatever it takes to clear his name and make sure this doesn't follow him." Angela studied him for a moment. "It's not just about the case," she said. "Elijah's been through a lot. If you're serious about being in his life, you need to do more than fix this one problem." Lionel nodded. "I know," he said. "But this is a start." Angela explained the legal options they had, including appealing to have the charges dropped entirely. Lionel agreed to cover all legal fees and pledged to use his resources to ensure a favorable outcome. Angela couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope for Elijah, but she also knew that money alone wouldn't fix the rift between father and son. That a few days later, Lionel invited Elijah to visit his company's headquarters. Nadia was hesitant but ultimately agreed, warning Lionel not to overwhelm Elijah. "This isn't about showing off," she told him. "Keep it simple." When Elijah arrived, Lionel was waiting for him in the sleek lobby of the glass-walled building. Employees moved briskly around them, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors. "Welcome," Lionel said with a smile, extending a hand. Elijah hesitated before shaking it. "Thanks," Elijah said, his voice quiet. He followed Lionel through the building, feeling out of place among the suits and ties. Lionel led him to a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. "I wanted to show you what I do," Lionel said, gesturing to a table covered with prototypes and blueprints. "This is where we design and develop new technologies. It's a little overwhelming at first, but I thought you might find it interesting." Elijah's eyes scanned the table, landing on a prototype for a skateboarding app. "What's this?" he asked, picking it up. "That's something we're working on to track skateboarding tricks and routes," Lionel explained. "It's still in development, but it's one of my favorite projects." Elijah couldn't hide his curiosity. "That's actually pretty cool," he admitted. Lionel smiled, relieved to see a spark of interest. "Maybe you can test it out for us sometime," he said. "Give us feedback." Elijah nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time, he felt like Lionel was making an effort to connect with him, not as a business tycoon, but as a father. That evening, Lionel dropped Elijah off at home. Nadia was waiting at the door, her arms crossed. "How did it go?" she asked, her eyes darting between the two of them. "It was interesting," Elijah said, glancing at Lionel. "He showed me some of the stuff they're working on. It wasn't bad." Lionel chuckled softly. "High praise," he said, earning a small smile from Nadia. Before he left, Lionel turned to Elijah. "I'm proud of you," he said. "For how you've handled everything. You're stronger than I ever was at your age." Elijah looked at him, unsure how to respond. "Thanks," he said after a moment. As Lionel walked back to his car, Nadia and Elijah stepped inside. "He's really trying, isn't he?" Elijah said, his tone uncertain. Nadia nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "He is," she said. "But let's see if it lasts." That night, as Elijah lay in bed, he thought about the day's events. For the first time, he felt a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, Lionel was serious about being in his life. It wasn't enough to erase the years of absence, but it was a start. And for now, that was all he could ask for. The following weeks marked a cautious yet significant shift in the dynamic between Lionel, Elijah, and Nadia. Lionel was determined to prove himself, not through grand gestures, but through consistent action. He began to show up, not just physically, but emotionally, in ways that surprised both Elijah and Nadia. One Saturday morning, Lionel arrived at their apartment early, carrying 2 boxes of donuts and a steaming tray of coffee. Elijah, still in his pajamas, opened the door and stared at him in confusion. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I thought we could spend the day together," Lionel said, holding up the donuts. "And I brought breakfast." Elijah hesitated, glancing back at his mom, who stood in the kitchen drying dishes. Nadia gave him a small nod, her expression unreadable. "All right," Elijah said, stepping aside to let Lionel in. Over breakfast, Lionel made an effort to engage Elijah in conversation. He asked about school, his friends, and his hobbies. Elijah responded cautiously at first, but as the conversation shifted to skateboarding, he began to relax. "I used to skateboard when I was your age," Lionel said, taking a sip of coffee. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "You skateboard?" Lionel chuckled. "I wasn't very good, but I tried. I even broke my arm once attempting a trick I had no business trying." Elijah smirked, the mental image of his polished, corporate father on a skateboard both amusing and oddly comforting. "What trick was it?" "A kickflip," Lionel admitted, laughing. "I'm guessing you're better than I ever was." "Probably," Elijah said, his tone light but teasing. For the first time, the tension between them seemed to ease, and Lionel felt a flicker of hope that he was finally breaking through the wall Elijah had built around himself. Later that day, Lionel took Elijah to a skate park he had quietly funded years ago. It was one of his first philanthropic projects, though he had never thought much about it until now. As they arrived, Elijah's eyes lit up. The park was sprawling, with ramps, rails, and bowls designed for skaters of all levels. "You helped build this?" Elijah asked, disbelief evident in his voice. Lionel nodded. "I did," he said. "I thought it was important to give kids a place to do what they love. I just didn't think I'd ever have a son who'd use it." Elijah grabbed his skateboard from the back seat of Lionel's car and headed for the park without another word. Lionel watched from the sidelines, a small smile on his face as Elijah effortlessly navigated the ramps and rails. The boy's confidence and skill were undeniable, and for the first time, Lionel saw a part of himself in Elijah, not in his physical features, but in his determination and focus. After an hour, Elijah skated over to where Lionel was sitting. "You want to try?" he asked, holding out his board. Lionel laughed, shaking his head. "I think I'll leave the tricks to you," he said. "But I'll watch." Elijah shrugged and returned to the park, but this time, he glanced back at Lionel every so often, as if checking to see if he was still there. Lionel didn't leave, not even when the sun began to set. He stayed until Elijah had his fill, and when they finally left, Elijah climbed into the car with a small but genuine smile on his face. Meanwhile, Nadia was cautiously observing from the sidelines. She couldn't deny that Lionel was making an effort, but she still struggled to fully trust him. One evening, after Elijah had gone to bed, Lionel stayed behind to talk with her. "Thank you for letting me spend time with him," Lionel said, sitting at the small kitchen table. Nadia crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "I'm not doing this for you," she said. "I'm doing it for him." "I know," Lionel replied. "But I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I made mistakes, terrible ones, but I'm trying to fix them." Nadia's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained firm. "Elijah's been hurt before. I won't let you do that to him again." "I won't," Lionel said, his tone steady. "I'm here for the long haul, Nadia. Not just for him, but for you too. I owe you both that." Nadia didn't respond right away. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his words were genuine. Finally, she sighed. "We'll see," she said. "But if you break his heart again, Lionel, I swear." "I won't," Lionel interrupted. "You have my word." As the days turned into weeks, Elijah began to see Lionel not as the distant figure he had resented for so long, but as a man trying to make amends. They started spending more time together, working on Elijah's school projects, practicing tricks at the skate park, and even cooking, albeit poorly, in the kitchen. The bond between them grew slowly but steadily, and for the first time, Elijah felt like he had a real father. Nadia, too, began to let her guard down. Though she remained wary, she couldn't deny that Lionel was making progress. He was no longer the selfish, career-obsessed man she had known all those years ago. He was present, attentive, and, most importantly, he was there for Elijah. One evening, as the three of them sat together at the dinner table, Elijah looked up from his plate. "You know," he said, his tone casual but sincere, "this is kinda nice." "What is?" Lionel asked. "Us," Elijah said, gesturing to the table. "This feels like a family." Lionel smiled, his chest tightening with emotion. "It does," he said softly. "And it's all I've ever wanted." Nadia said nothing, but the small, approving nod she gave was enough. For the first time in years, there was hope, not just for Elijah, but for all of them. The past wasn't erased, but the future was beginning to take shape, one moment at a time. Over the next few weeks, Lionel continued to integrate himself into Elijah's life in ways both big and small. He made an effort to be present for everything Elijah cared about: school meetings, skateboarding competitions, and even simple dinners at home. But despite his consistent efforts, Lionel couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was still on probation, not just with Elijah, but with Nadia too. One morning, Elijah was getting ready for school when Lionel showed up unexpectedly. Nadia opened the door, her expression immediately suspicious. "You're here early," she said. Lionel smiled sheepishly. "I thought I could drive Elijah to school," he said. "If that's okay." Nadia crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Elijah already has a routine, Lionel. Don't disrupt it just because you feel like it." "It's not about me," Lionel said quickly. "I just want to spend more time with him." Before Nadia could reply, Elijah appeared behind her, backpack slung over one shoulder. "It's fine, Mom," he said. "He can drive me today." Nadia hesitated but eventually stepped aside. "Fine," she said. "But don't make a habit of being late." In the car, the silence between Lionel and Elijah was initially awkward. Lionel wasn't sure how to start a conversation without coming across as overbearing, and Elijah seemed more focused on the passing scenery than his father. Finally, Lionel spoke. "How's school going?" he asked, his tone casual. Elijah shrugged. "It's fine, I guess." "Just fine." Lionel pressed. "No favorite classes? Teachers you like?" Elijah hesitated, then glanced at him. "I like history," he said. "We're learning about the civil rights movement right now." "It's interesting." Lionel nodded, his interest piqued. "That's a great topic," he said. "Did you know your grandfather, my dad, was part of the protests in the 1960s? Elijah's eyebrows shot up. "Really? You've never talked about that." "There's a lot I haven't told you," Lionel admitted, his voice softening. "But I'd like to, if you're interested." Elijah didn't respond immediately, but Lionel could see the flicker of curiosity in his son's eyes. "Yeah," Elijah said finally. "I think I'd like that." Meanwhile, Nadia was grappling with her own feelings about Lionel's increasing presence. She appreciated his efforts, but she couldn't forget the years of absence and the pain it had caused her in Elijah. One evening, after Elijah had gone to bed, Lionel stayed behind to talk with her. They sat in the living room, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Lionel broke the silence first. "I know you don't trust me yet," he said. "And I don't blame you. But I hope you can see that I'm trying." Nadia sighed, crossing her legs. "You are trying," she admitted. And I can see the difference it's making for Elijah. But it's hard, Lionel. It's hard to let go of the anger. I understand, Lionel said, his voice steady. But I'm not asking you to forgive me overnight. I just want a chance to prove that I've changed. Nadia looked at him, her expression conflicted. You've done a lot, Lionel, she said. But this isn't just about showing up now. It's about staying. Elijah needs stability. He needs to know you're not going to walk away again. I won't, Lionel said firmly. I've already missed too much. I'm not going anywhere. As Lionel and Nadia worked to rebuild their trust, Elijah began to experience subtle but meaningful changes in his own life. At school, he felt more confident, no longer weighed down by the feeling of being invisible or unsupported. His teachers noticed his newfound focus, and even his classmates seemed to view him differently. One afternoon, during lunch, his best friend Malik sat across from him, grinning. So, I saw your dad at the skate park the other day, Malik said. Didn't think he'd stick around this long. Elijah smirked, taking a bite of his sandwich. Yeah, me neither, he admitted. But he's trying. Malik nodded. That's cool, man. He seems alright. Elijah shrugged, though he couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. For the first time, he wasn't ashamed to talk about his dad. Lionel's efforts culminated in a special gesture that surprised both Elijah and Nadia. One evening, he invited them to dinner at a community center he had helped renovate. When they arrived, they found the space filled with families, kids, and local leaders. A banner hung across the room read, Carmichael Initiative for Youth Empowerment. What is this? Nadia asked, glancing around. This is for Elijah, Lionel said, his voice filled with emotion. I wanted to create something meaningful, something inspired by him. This initiative will provide resources for kids like Elijah who need support, mentorship, and a safe place to grow. Elijah's eyes widened as Lionel led them around the center, showing off the skateboarding facilities, computer labs, and study rooms. You did all this? Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You inspired me, Lionel said. You made me realize how much more I could be doing, not just for you, but for kids everywhere. Nadia stood quietly, her arms crossed, but there was no denying the admiration in her eyes. For the first time, she began to believe that Lionel's transformation was real. That night, as they drove home, Elijah couldn't stop smiling. That was amazing, he said. I didn't think you cared that much. I care more than you know, Lionel replied, his voice soft but sincere. And I'll keep showing you, Elijah. Every day. As they pulled up to the apartment, Nadia turned to Lionel. You're starting to win me over, she said, her tone cautious but genuine. Lionel smiled, a rare flicker of hope in his eyes. That's all I can ask for, he said. For the first time in years, it felt like the pieces of their fractured family were finally coming together. And while the past couldn't be erased, the future was starting to look brighter. As the months passed, Lionel's presence in Elijah's life became more consistent. What had once been awkward and tentative now began to feel natural. Lionel wasn't just a visitor or a well-meaning stranger anymore, he was becoming a father in every sense of the word. Elijah noticed the change in himself too. He wasn't just the kid who had grown up without a dad, he was finally allowing himself to believe that Lionel's efforts were genuine. One Saturday morning, Lionel arrived at their apartment with a surprise. He parked his car in front of the building and waved for Elijah to come outside. When Elijah stepped out, he stopped in his tracks, his jaw dropping at the sight before him. There, in the back of Lionel's truck, was a brand new, custom-made skateboard ramp. What is this? Elijah stammered, his eyes wide. I figured you could use a practice ramp, Lionel said, grinning. We can set it up in the backyard or wherever you want. It's yours. Elijah ran his hands over the smooth wood, his disbelief giving way to excitement. "This is amazing," he said, turning to Lionel. "How did you even?" "I asked around at the skate park," Lionel admitted. "Some of the guys there helped me design it. I figured you'd know what to do with it." Elijah's smile was wide and genuine. "This is awesome," he said. "Thanks, Dad." The word Dad caught both of them by surprise. Elijah hadn't called Lionel that before, not intentionally, anyway. The moment hung in the air for a beat before Lionel's expression softened. "You're welcome, son," Lionel said quietly. The ramp wasn't just a gift, it became a way for them to bond. Lionel spent hours outside with Elijah, watching him practice tricks and cheering him on. Elijah even taught him a few basic moves, laughing every time Lionel wobbled or nearly fell. It wasn't perfect, Lionel wasn't exactly built for skateboarding, but the effort mattered more than anything else. Nadia watched from the window, a small smile on her face. She still had her reservations about Lionel, but she couldn't deny the positive effect he was having on Elijah. Her son seemed happier, more confident, and less guarded. And for that, she was grateful. As Lionel's relationship with Elijah strengthened, he also began to address the lingering tension with Nadia. One evening, after Elijah had gone to bed, Lionel stayed behind to talk. They sat at the kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. "Nadia," Lionel began, his tone serious, "I know I've said this before, but I want to say it again. I'm sorry, for everything. For leaving, for not being there when you needed me, for all the pain I caused." Nadia looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It's not just about me, Lionel," she said. "It's about Elijah. He's the one who needed you the most." "I know," Lionel said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'll never forgive myself for that. But I'm here now, and I'm going to keep showing up, for both of you." Nadia studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You've changed," she said softly. "I can see that. But it's going to take more than words to erase the past." "I don't expect to erase it," Lionel said. "I just want to build a better future." Nadia nodded slowly. "Then keep doing what you're doing," she said. "But don't mess this up, Lionel. Because if you do, there won't be another chance." "I won't," Lionel promised. That in the midst of this progress, an unexpected challenge arose. The media had caught wind of Lionel's efforts to reconnect with Elijah, and reporters began digging into their story. One afternoon, as Elijah was leaving school, a journalist approached him with a camera crew. "Elijah," the reporter called out, shoving a microphone in his face. "What's it like having Lionel Carmichael as your father? Do you think his philanthropy is just a PR move?" Elijah froze, his heart racing. He hadn't expected to be ambushed like this. Before he could respond, Lionel pulled up in his car, stepping out to shield Elijah from the cameras. "That's enough," Lionel said firmly, his tone authoritative. "Leave him alone. He's a minor, and you have no right to harass him like this." The reporter hesitated, but Lionel's presence was commanding enough to make them back off. He guided Elijah into the car, his expression a mix of anger and concern. "You okay?" Lionel asked as they drove away. Elijah nodded, though his hands were still shaking. "I didn't know they'd do that," he said. "I'm sorry," Lionel said, his voice sincere. "This is my fault. I should have anticipated this and done more to protect you." "It's not your fault," Elijah said quietly. I don't like being the center of attention." "I'll handle it," Lionel said. "I promise you won't have to deal with that again." True to his word, Lionel issued a statement through his public relations team, requesting privacy for his family and warning the media to stay away from Elijah's school. He also arranged for additional security to ensure that Elijah felt safe. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Nadia, who saw just how far Lionel was willing to go to protect their son. As the days went by, the media attention began to fade, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Elijah was able to focus on his schoolwork, his skateboarding, and his growing relationship with Lionel. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a family, one that was imperfect but committed to moving forward together. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Elijah looked at his mom and dad and said, "I don't know where we're going from here, but I'm glad we're trying." Nadia smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "So am I," she said. Lionel reached across the table, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "This is just the beginning," he said. "And I'm not going anywhere." The months that followed marked a transformation in the lives of Elijah, Nadia, and Lionel. What had started as tentative steps toward reconciliation blossomed into something more solid, something resembling a real family. It wasn't perfect, and the scars of the past hadn't completely healed, but the effort and care they poured into rebuilding their bond were undeniable. For Elijah, life began to feel lighter. With Lionel's steady presence and unwavering support, he found himself thriving in ways he hadn't thought possible. He excelled in school, earning praise from teachers who noticed his newfound focus and confidence. His skateboarding skills continued to grow, and he even began mentoring younger kids at the local skate park, teaching them tricks and encouraging them to stay out of trouble. One evening, Lionel invited Elijah and Nadia to a formal gala hosted by the Carmichael Initiative. The event was meant to celebrate the Foundation's accomplishments, particularly its efforts to support underprivileged youth. Nadia hesitated when the invitation came, unsure if she was ready to step into Lionel's high-profile world. But Elijah was eager to attend, and she ultimately agreed. The gala was held in a grand ballroom, its walls adorned with shimmering lights and banners showcasing the initiative's achievements. Elijah looked sharp in a tailored suit, though he couldn't help fidgeting with his tie as they walked inside. Nadia, dressed in an elegant navy gown, looked composed but alert, her eyes scanning the room. Lionel greeted them near the entrance, his smile warm and genuine. "You both look amazing," he said, his gaze lingering on Elijah. "I'm glad you came." Elijah grinned. "It's different," he said, glancing around at the opulent decor. "But cool." As the evening progressed, Lionel took every opportunity to introduce Nadia and Elijah to his colleagues and friends, proudly sharing their story. At first, Nadia felt uncomfortable with the attention, but as she listened to Lionel speak about Elijah, his pride evident in every word, she began to relax. During the speeches, Lionel took to the stage. He looked out at the crowd, his expression serious but heartfelt. "When I started the Carmichael Initiative, it was about giving back to the community that shaped me," he began. "But over the past few months, this work has taken on a deeper meaning. It's not just about giving back, it's about making amends. My son, Elijah, has taught me more about resilience and courage than I ever thought possible. He's the reason I'm here tonight, and he's the reason I'll continue to fight for a better future for all our kids." The room erupted in applause, and Elijah, seated beside Nadia, felt a lump rise in his throat. For so long, he had questioned whether he mattered to Lionel, whether he was anything more than an afterthought. But hearing those words, he felt something shift. For the first time, he believed that his father truly saw him. After the gala, the three of them returned to the apartment, still buzzing from the night's events. Elijah plopped onto the couch, pulling at his tie. "That was a lot," he said, grinning. "But it was kind of awesome." Nadia chuckled, kicking off her heels. "You handled it well," she said. "Better than I expected." Lionel sat down beside Elijah, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, "I meant every word I said tonight. You've changed my life, Elijah. Both of you have." Elijah looked at him, his smile fading into something softer, more genuine. "Thanks," he said. "That means a lot." Nadia watched the exchange quietly, her heart full. For years, she had carried the weight of raising Elijah alone, and she had guarded her heart fiercely, afraid to let anyone in. But now, as she looked at Lionel and Elijah together, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. The next morning, Lionel surprised Elijah with one final gesture. As they ate breakfast, Lionel handed him an envelope. "What's this?" Elijah asked, eyeing it curiously. "Open it," Lionel said, his voice tinged with excitement. Inside was a flyer for a national skateboarding competition, along with a registration form and a note that read, "All expenses covered, go show them what you've got." Elijah's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Dead serious," Lionel said. "You've got the talent, Elijah. It's time to show the world." Elijah stared at the flyer, his hands trembling slightly. "This is amazing," he said. "Thank you." Lionel smiled, ruffling Elijah's hair. "You've earned it, kid." Over the next few weeks, Elijah poured himself into preparing for the competition. Lionel and Nadia supported him every step of the way, cheering him on during practice and helping him balance his training with schoolwork. By the time the competition arrived, Elijah was ready. The event was held at a massive indoor skate park, packed with spectators and competitors from across the country. As Elijah stepped up to the starting line, he glanced over at the stands, where Lionel and Nadia were seated together, their expressions filled with pride and encouragement. "You've got this," Lionel mouthed, giving him a thumbs up. Elijah took a deep breath, gripping his skateboard tightly. This was his moment, a chance to prove not just to the world, but to himself, that he was capable of greatness. When he finished his run, the crowd erupted in cheers. Elijah beamed as he looked up at his parents, who were standing and clapping with tears in their eyes. For the first time, he felt truly whole, a young man with a bright future and a family who believed in him. As they drove home that evening, Elijah sat in the back seat, holding the trophy he had won. He glanced at Lionel and Nadia in the front, their quiet conversation filling the car with warmth. For the first time, he allowed himself to think not just about the past they had overcome, but about the future they were building together. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And that was enough. The conclusion of this story is a testament to the power of redemption, resilience, and the strength of family bonds. It highlights that while the past cannot be changed, it doesn't have to define the future. Lionel's transformation from a distant, absentee father to an active, caring parent shows that even those who have made grave mistakes can find a path to redemption if they are willing to put in the work and take responsibility for their actions. Elijah's journey is equally inspiring. Despite the pain of abandonment, he finds the courage to open his heart and give his father a chance. His growth from a guarded, frustrated teenager to a confident young man with a bright future serves as a powerful reminder that love and support can bring out the best in people, even in the most difficult circumstances. Nadia's perspective is particularly poignant. As a mother who carried the weight of responsibility for years, her cautious approach to trusting Lionel reflects the realities many single parents face. Her eventual willingness to let go of some of her anger, while still protecting Elijah, demonstrates the delicate balance between forgiveness and self-preservation. The story's ending is satisfying because it doesn't offer an overly polished resolution. Instead, it acknowledges that healing is a process, one that requires time, effort, and patience. The characters are flawed and human, but they work together to rebuild their relationships, creating a foundation for a better future. Ultimately, this story reminds us that family is not just about shared blood, but about showing up for one another, time and time again. It's about accountability, love, and the willingness to change, not just for yourself, but for the people you care about. The journey may be messy, but the reward of finding and rebuilding those connections is worth every step.